Hi guys, welcome back to the next part of the MAUI pipelines video series. In the previous videos, we set up our Windows, Android, and iOS build jobs, and we published each app's artifact to Azure as well, so that our release pipeline can consume that. But before we get to setting up our release pipelines, I wanted to create a video on versioning our apps, since we'll in any case need to always release a higher version to the App Store for it to be accepted. So before we get started on versioning, I think there's just a couple of concepts to understand. The first one is the difference between the version code and the version name, as Android calls it. So your version name is usually in the format of major, minor, and they call it point here. And it's usually based on this semantic versioning format where you have a major, minor patch, and then some companies or people prefer to add a revision as well as a fourth character. If we look at the Apple docs, they actually also reference the semantic versioning website here for their versioning. The second thing to understand is the version code, which is a positive integer that should be incrementing with every single release. And it can go up to 2.1 billion. So there is an upper limit, but it's very large. This version isn't shown to the user, and it is kind of used in the background to ensure that it protects from downgrading the APK to a lower version again. So if we go look at our MAUI project in the Csproj, you'll see there's an ApplicationDisplayVersion and an ApplicationVersion. So they all call it something slightly different, but the display version is that bold version where you can have the 3 or 4 characters, and then the application version is the version code, which is the always incrementing integer. So we essentially want our pipelines to be updating these two values in our Csproj. So coming back to our build script, I'm going to give you a couple of different strategies that you can consider and can tweak onto your liking. So the format that we said we wanted the build version to be in, so I'm just going to create a variable here called app build version. And I'm creating this right on my pipeline itself, even before the stages, so that all my stages can consume this variable. And the value that I'm giving this variable is going to be in the format of x.x.x. So an easy way to do this is moving it into variables. So we can do a $ app version major, $ app version minor, and an app version patch for our build version. And we can then also set this as the current build's name. So currently, if you go have a look at our pipeline, the names is just a squashed up format of the current date and a revision number for that day. So instead, I want that build to say what this version is going to be, which just makes it easier to identify your various builds in the pipelines. So I'm just going to copy the same part here and set that as the name of the pipeline's build iteration. Now, we still then also need to specify our version code. And this needs to be auto-incrementing, so it always needs to be a unique number. So what some people do is they add, I'm just going to add a plus here to distinguish it from the build version. But what some people use is a predefined variable called BuildId. If we can go to the docs and we have a look at the use predefined variables in Microsoft Learn docs there, and we just search for BuildId, you can see we have access to a build.buildid, and this is an integer that's always incrementing for all builds on your organization. So something worth noting is that it might get to the 2.1 billion if you have multiple apps in your organization and you're doing PR builds and everything. That number would increase quite quickly. So if that is something you are concerned about, I'll give you other solutions as well. But I'll just show you what this looks like. Build.buildId. So we're not consuming this yet or setting this as our MAUI version, our MAUI build version, but I just want to set it as the name of this build iteration so that you can kind of see the different versioning strategies. So I'll just have to create these 3 variables in my pipeline. So go to my library. I'm going to create a new variable group just to group it on its own. So I'm just going to call this version variables. And we had those 3 variables, which was app version major, which I'm going to set to 1, and app version minor can be 0, and app version patch. So this now gives us complete control on when we want to bump these 3 sections of our version. After we've created our group, we just need to add it here to our variables as well. Just going to add group, and we call that group our version variables group. So I can then commit all these changes, and that will kick off a new build. And here it says the pipeline now needs access to this new group as well. So we can permit access to that group. And there you can see it is now actually displaying our build version and our version code. So as you can see, we're already on 222 because there was already 221 other builds just in this org. So that number could increase quite rapidly, but getting to 2.1 billion would take a while. So I'm just canceling that build so that I'm not wasting any unnecessary build minutes. So another option would be to specify our own version code as well in the version variables group called version code. And I'm going to make that 1 for now. And what we can do is auto increment this variable in our library every time after we've done a successful release to the app stores. So I'll show you how to do that once I've set up the first part of the release pipelines. But I'm just going to make this change so that I consume this version code now in my script first. So instead of having build.buildId, I'm just going to have then app version code as well. So if we commit this, it will kick off a new build. And there we can see it's now 100 plus 1. So obviously as is, it's not going to auto increment, but I'll show you in a bit how to do that. So one other version strategy that I just also want to give you is some people prefer to use a version of the date for their versioning strategy. So if we go to the Microsoft Docs, so going to the Microsoft Docs called Run and Build Numbers, it gives you a lot of interesting information on that you can use for your versioning strategy. So the first thing that you'll see here is this rev r, which is also quite a handy built-in variable that basically allows you to, as you add that, it will continuously increment every time you do a build, as long as the part in front of it stays constant. And then rev r resets to 1 every time the part in front of it changes. So you can, for example, use that for your patch of your build version, but you won't be able to use that for your version code because your version code needs to auto increment continuously. Even if you update major or minor versions, your version code needs to be a version higher every single time you do a release. So that's something else you could consider. But yeah, one interesting strategy that I've also seen is some people use a subset of the date to create their version. So for example, you could take the year and put that as your major, just 2 characters of the year. You can take the month for your minor. And then you can also take day of month for your patch version. And then your build version would look like that. So unfortunately, I can't use this app build version variable directly in the name, since it's not quite ready to be consumed yet when I set the name of the pipeline. But there are ways that you can add it inside one of your job steps that you can, in a PowerShell script or so, you can also set this name. So it is possible if you want to do some fancy footwork in a script before you set your build iterations name. So I'm just going to run this and show you what this looks like. So coming back to the pipelines, we can now see that it did exactly what we thought it would. It says 24 for the year as our major version, 8 for the month, and then 24 for the day. So you kind of have to start with the year at the front, month, and day, because yeah, obviously otherwise your major is going to increment more rapidly than your minor. So yeah, this is also quite an interesting versioning strategy because it kind of gives you an immediate indication of what day this build was done as well. So also something cool to consider. But regardless, we still have to increment that version code every single time we do a successful release. So I'll show you how to do that now. So I'm just going to cancel this build and I'm going to revert that, since I prefer to have some control over my major, minor, and patch versions. But yeah, that's up for you to decide how you want to handle the build version part. So before I get to the auto incrementing of the app version code, I'm just going to pull this into my actual MAUI builds. So you can go to your .NET publish part. And if you recall from the previous videos, I mentioned that we can use these -p to update any parameter in our Csproj. So we're going to want to do a -p. And what we want to update is this ApplicationDisplayVersion. And we want to set that to our build version. And then we also want to add the application version, which is our version code. So I'm going to take from here. So I remember there was one funny thing with iOS at some stage where these two values were flipped around. So I'll just have to confirm if it works Otherwise, we'll just have to swap them around. So then I want to do the same thing for Windows and for my Android build as well. Great. We can commit and push this, so it starts off a new build. Great, so that has started. Great, so we can see it successfully built our app and set the version for both iOS, Android, and Windows apps as 1.0.0 with a version code of 1. So currently the version code and the patch and everything is hard-coded now in our library. So I'll show you now how we can auto-increment those variables in our library with every successful release to the various app stores. Great, so now that we've built our app successfully with the build version set in our library, I want to show you how you can auto-increment your version code, and I'll also auto-increment the patch version as well, just to show you how you can do that by setting up a release pipeline, but it's not yet going to actually release our app. It's just going to have the one step to auto-increment the version codes. In the next video, I will continue on this release pipeline to actually do a release to the app stores. So I'm going to click on New Pipeline, and I'm going to scroll all the way down to Empty Job and click Apply. And we have our first stage here, which is going to be, in this case, our auto increment step. So I'm just going to say increment version, or app version. And I can save that. You can add a comment here, and which just helps to see the history as you're making changes to this. You can review compare the differences that was made every time you selected save. So we're going to go to tasks, and we only have the one task at the moment, the increment app version task. We're going to set our job here. So we want this to be an Azure Pipelines hosted job, and I'm going to choose Windows latest just to keep it simple. And very important to select this allow scripts to access the OAuth token for this task, since we want to add a script step to this job that needs to update the library, and it will need to do that via an API to tell Azure DevOps, okay, this is now the incremented version of that variable. And to be able to do that, you do need the OAuth token to make that change. So I'm going to add that. So we can go ahead and add a PowerShell task. And this script will run inline to auto-increment our versioning variables in our library. The first thing that you'll have to add here is a environmental variable in the environmental variables group. So you can just click on the add, and this is called Azure DevOps ext pat, which is the personal access token that the release pipeline will need to use to be able to call the Azure DevOps API to update our variables. So the value for this is going to be $ and in brackets system.access token. And you can see I got that from the Microsoft Docs called Sign in with a Personal Access Token. So you can read through this to gain some additional understanding around that. Next, we'll have to add our variable group to our pipeline so that our pipeline can read the existing versioning variables. So it won't be able to update it directly, but that's what we're going to use the API for. So we can go into the variables tab, into variables group, link variable group, and then we can choose the group that we want to link here, the version variables. And I'm going to let it apply for the entire release pipeline, not just this one stage. So I'm going to link that. So now our PowerShell script will be able to access or read these variables by simply referencing them as we normally would. So I want to set an updated version patch, which is equal to the variable app version patch plus 1. So that will then read the current version patch and increment it by 1. And I want to do the same thing just to show you how this also works for the version code. I'm going to update both of these in the same script. So every time this script runs, it will increment both the app version patch and the app version code by 1. So we can then call the Azure DevOps API to actually perform this update and set this version as the new version for the patch and this one as the new version for the version code. And what we'll need to do is call the API called AZ pipelines variable group variable update. So you can just Google for that. AZ pipelines variable group variable. And if you go into the Microsoft Docs, you'll see there's a bunch of different commands. So you can create variables in your library. You can delete variables in your library. You can list all the variables that's in your group, or you can perform an update on a variable. And that's obviously what we're interested in doing. So you can copy this and go back to your script and paste it in. And the group ID you can get by going to your library and going into the variable group. And in the URL here at the top, if you go along far enough, you'll see variable group equals, and in my case, it's 9. So that's what my variable group ID is that I want to update. The name of the variable that I'd like to update first is the version patch, the app version patch. And then we have a bunch of optional parameters, and I want to set the value. So my value will be updated version patch. I'm just going to remove this so that it doesn't complain. Great. So before we'll actually be able to call this command, we'll first have to do a sign in with our Azure DevOps EXT packed access token. So you can do that by using AZ DevOps login. If we Google for that, and you go to this document, sign in with a personal access token, they give you some examples of what you could call. So I'm going to copy this one. I'm not going to set the organization in this command, since I want to target the project as well in the next command. So I'm going to paste that in, and then where the hashtags are, we're just going to instead paste our Azure DevOps EXT path in there. So this now allows this pipeline to access the or be able to perform secure API calls to Azure DevOps to be able to actually make these kind of updates. but we still need to specify which project we're going to target. And we can do that with a command called Azure DevOps configure. So we can Google that, and we can go to the Azure DevOps configure. So the -d gives it the default arguments, and we'll have to specify our organization and then our project as well. So I'm going to copy this part and paste it in here, and I'm going to add the -d for the default, and we are targeting the organization. And if we have a look at the docs again, it's in the format of the URL. So it's devs.azure.com and then your organization's name. And we can just copy that from our URL here at the top. And we just need a closing slash there. And then we also just want to specify which project we are targeting. So we can copy that as well from the URL here at the top to make sure we don't make a typo. And there we go. So we are now logging into our Azure DevOps, and we have set the organization and the project that we're targeting. And then we do the AZ pipelines variable group variable update command. Specify the group ID as 9. Specify the variable that we want to update, and provide this local variable that we created as the new value, which is +1 from what we've read from the library. So it's a couple of steps, but it's not too bad. So I'm going to copy and paste this whole section again, and this time I want to update the version code. So this app version code variable, and I'm going to use this local variable that I created, updated version code, to perform that update. Great, so we can save that. We can go back to the entire pipeline. We'll need to add just the artifact that we're targeting here. So we're not going to consume it yet, but we can add that in. It's by default going to try and access the latest version. That's the alias that it's going to call it. And it just kind of gives you also like an idea of what's currently available to consume in this in these artifacts, which is our iOS, Windows, and Android folders. I'm going to add that. And I just want to go back to my increment version, app version task. And if you scroll down to the artifact download, it's going to download all 3 artifacts every time it's trying to increment our patch and version code. But we're not actually using these artifacts in this specific task. We will be using it in the other ones that actually publishes the artifacts to the stores. But for this one, we don't need it. So I'm just going to deselect them all and save again. And then we can go back to our library, into our variable group, and we want to go to the security section here, because we need to allow our build pipeline or our release pipeline to actually make updates to this variable group. And you can see currently the build service only has reader permissions and not administrator. So you want to change that to administrator so that it can actually perform updates to this variable group. So we're going to save that. And then we can perform our first release. Go back to releases, click on the create release. And it successfully detected the latest build that we've done. So currently our patch is 0, so we expect that to increment to 1, and our version code is 1, so expect that to be 2 after this step has completed. So you click create. You can go in, view the logs to view it live. And it executed successfully, so we can go back to our library and see we can see it was last modified now by our build service. So if we go in here, we can now see the version code is now 2 and the patch is now 1. So both incremented successfully. So if we kick off a new build now, it will be 101 and version code 2. So it did exactly what we wanted to do. So in the next video, we can then add the stage to actually perform the deployment to the appropriate app stores, and then only upon successfully completing those, we can execute this increment app version step. So if there's for some reason we can't push to the stores, whatever, then it won't automatically increment our versions, and that way we have a bit more control on when we are incrementing the versions only after those successful pushes to the store. So well done for getting to this point. So be sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss out on the future videos where we'll actually be performing our releases to the app stores. See you next time.